So my talk is called Navigating Psychedelic Medicines Through National and International Regulation. We'll see why all of those words become important and somewhat problematic. As we heard from Charlotte, really it's the UN conventions that frame our drug laws. The 1961, 1971, and 1988 UN conventions. Essentially, they require member states to criminalise personal use, cultivation, supply of illicit substances. That really frames the laws of all member states of the UN. So if we look to America, and the key act there is the Controlled Substances Act. It separates drugs into various schedules. There are real inconsistencies and problems with those schedules. For example, cannabis is in Schedule 1 and yet methamphetamine is in Schedule 2. So there are, at the minimum, incongruities within the Controlled Substances Act. Now, something that America has that we don't is a written constitution. And the 10th Amendment to the American Constitution, which was in the Bill of Rights, says that any laws that haven't been given to the United States, to the federal United States, remain with the states themselves or with the people. So what we have in America is this developing patchwork quilt of marijuana legalization. You can see in the dark green areas, those states have been legalized for recreational and medical use. In the lighter green areas, for medical use only, and you'll see Florida has now joined that club. And on the election for Trump back in November, there was also a referendum about medical marijuana, and that vote went through. So those states, those individual states, actually have a form of very direct democracy. If there's a certain number of people signing a petition, then there has to be a referendum that goes statewide. And that clearly is something that we don't have in this country. Now, in America, if you are going to be researching psychedelics, you are going to be dealing with the Drug Enforcement Administration, who will grant licenses to perform any research, and then to actually bring that drug to market and to obtain a license for that product, you're going to be dealing with the Food and Drug Administration. And I'll speak later about where MAPS are in their dealings with the Food and Drug Administration. But those are the two key bodies in America. Now, research is happening. We all know that research is happening. Johns Hopkins University, we had Bill Richards talking at this conference yesterday. We've heard that he's been using psilocybin in research for 17 or 18 years now. The most recent study was published with New York University, and the results are extremely positive, where 80 subjects were given one dose of psilocybin. These are all terminal cancer patients, and in something like 86% of them, they had an immediate and long-lasting beneficial mental impact. Slightly less famously, the University of South Florida produced a paper in 2013 which was entitled Hippocampal Neurogenesis in Fear-Conditioned Mice. Not only where the condition fear in mice was brought down through cannabis, but also there appeared to be neurogenesis in the hippocampus. I think that's pretty important stuff. Salk is a private research institute. Dr. Salk was the guy who invented the polio vaccine. And he, and I believe he gave that out to the world for free, but nevertheless he's been able to create a research institute. Salk have done some incredible research with cannabis and protein plaques in the brains of, I think, mice with the equivalent of Alzheimer's. And the belief is that Alzheimer's is formed by inflammation in the brain, that effectively protein plaques form in the brain, and they found that cannabinoids can break down those protein plaques. Again, I think that's extremely significant research. Yale did the breakthrough paper on ketamine for essentially treatment-resistant depression. That breakthrough paper was done back in 2000. And because ketamine is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, both as an anesthetic and for palliative use, as in pain relief use, ketamine is much easier to research. They did the breakthrough paper with treatment-resistant depression, and classically, that is then taken on by private organisations. We've already had a question today about how private organisations, for-profit businesses, are using this research. Johnson & Johnson, I'm sure you've all used Johnson & Johnson baby talc. They have a company called Janssen, it's part of their pharmaceutical companies, and they are going through the regulatory system producing effectively an S-ketamine nasal spray for acutely suicidal individuals. This is something that paramedics could be carrying in their supply. That's a bad word. That they could have in their ambulance, and it could be used for acutely suicidal individuals. In fact, the Food and Drug Administration just in 2016 granted breakthrough therapy status for an S-ketamine nasal spray. So again, we can see research is happening. We can't argue that the laws are not allowing research to happen. Research is happening. Now, if you're in Europe, or if you want to obtain a license in Europe, both to research and then to bring products onto market, you're going to be dealing with the European Medicines Agency. They're currently located in this country. Of course, some of you may have heard about Brexit, and I expect the European Medicines Agency to relocate, possibly to Lisbon. The European Medicines Agency are the equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration. They report to the European Commission, and the European Commission then make decisions about licensing drugs Europe-wide. If any member states have any issues, they can raise objections during that regulatory process, but not after. And therefore, a European Commission decision will apply Europe-wide. I'll come back to the importance of Brexit towards the end of the presentation. Now, if you're just wanting to work here in the UK, you're going to be dealing with these four bodies. You're going to be dealing with the Home Office. You're going to be dealing with the NHS Health Research Authority that will grant or not grant ethical approval to work with NHS patients. You're going to be working with the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, who will or will not grant licenses for new medicines. And you're going to be dealing with NICE as well. And NICE are the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and effectively they make decisions on a cost-benefit analysis of drugs that are brought to market, and those decisions are then used by individual health authorities as to whether they're going to be prescribing those medications. So what are the laws here in England and Wales? We've already heard from Charlotte, the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. That is the Criminal Act. That is the side of the law that deals with crime and criminal sentencing. It is the Misuse of Drugs regulations, however, it's the regulations that deal with the medical side, the medicinal side, and the research side. So, in Schedule 1 of the regulations, not of the Misuse of Drugs Act, we're all very familiar with Class A, Class B, Class C. The regulations have got schedules, and there are more schedules than there are classes. And in Schedule 1, for research, medicinal purposes, you can see all of the following drugs: cannabinol, derivatives, cannabis, cannabis resin, but not cannabidiol, CBD, as it's more commonly known. Fungus of any kind containing psilocin, or any ester, which includes psilocybin. Lysergide, or N-alkyl derivatives of lysergamide, and therefore LSD, is caught in Schedule 1. Mescaline, DMT, and finally any compound structurally derived from phenethylamine, including MDMA. So all of the classic psychedelics are in that schedule, which makes it the most difficult to do research with those substances. Schedule 2, amphetamine, diamorphine, ketamine, which was in Schedule 4, and essentially the further you go down the schedules, the easier it is to work with these substances. Ketamine was in Schedule 4, government is aware of increasing usage, increasing addiction with ketamine, increasing personal damage, physical damage, and they've moved it from Schedule 4 up into Schedule 2 to make it more difficult to work with that substance. Medicinal opium is also in Schedule 2. Many of you will be very familiar with Sativex. Sativex is an oral spray, an oral THC spray, which has gone through the regulatory process and received a license, but only for spasticity in multiple sclerosis. Okay, so it's been reduced to having a license just for that single condition. I'll come back to Sativex later. Now, there does seem to be more leeway for research with cannabis. Regulation 12 says where any person is authorised by a licence of the Secretary of State to cultivate plants of the genus cannabis, it shall not be unlawful for that person to cultivate any such plant in accordance with the terms of the licence and in compliance with any conditions attached. So that's put in there. That's put into Regulation 12. There's specific regulation about that. And therefore, if you want to call it this, there is more encouragement to research into cannabis than there is into the other classic psychedelics. And indeed, Regulation 13 allows there to be approval granted for cannabis smoking for research purposes. Unscheduled, I couldn't find iboga. I couldn't find ibogaine. I think that's the chemical name, 10-methoxyibogamine. I couldn't find that in those schedules, and therefore I presume it falls into the Psychoactive Substances Act from 2016.
Why?
That's called an open question, which I'm not going to deal with at this particular point. If you want to ask a closed question, which has a one-word answer, then I may deal with it. Now, my background, I was a disability lawyer for 10 years, both a legal aid lawyer and an adult social services lawyer. And so I would use the law to challenge the NHS or to challenge local authorities, social services departments, and I would use this process, judicial review. And so I've been thinking, right, are the regulations holding back research in this country? Is there any way that we can actually challenge these regulations? So I looked at judicial review. I didn't look at the criminal side. This is a civil side. This is a side where the High Court initially will be making decisions, Court of Appeal and Supreme Court. This is not a criminal challenge. So what is judicial review then? Well, as the name suggests, it is a claim to review the lawfulness of an enactment. So that would be a statute, or that would be any statutory instrument which is created under that statute, such as the misuse of drugs regulations, or a decision, action, or failure to act in relation to the exercise of a public function. Right, how do we go about doing this? The claim form's got to be filed promptly and in any event not later than 3 months after the grounds to make the claim first arose. You've got to be very quick. Once there's been a decision, you've got 3 months to get your claim in. Permission has to be granted by the High Court. You do not have an automatic right to go to the High Court. The High Court first has to grant permission that, in effect, your case is arguable. Okay, so there will be a paper hearing, and if necessary, an oral hearing, and even appeal hearing about the decision to or not to grant permission. If permission is granted, then the case can go up to the High Court for a full trial. Now, judicial review is a review of the legality of the decision-making process. It is not a review of the decision itself. This is not what we would call an appellate jurisdiction. This is not an appeal that's going to be where a decision is going to be overturned and a judge is going to substitute a new decision. This is a review of the decision-making process. The traditional 3 grounds of judicial review: illegality, procedural impropriety, and irrationality. Essentially, a judge has to determine that a public body used the decision-making process irrationally, arrived at an irrational conclusion, that the public body didn't understand the law correctly, that they made an illegal decision, or they didn't apply the law correctly, or that there was something procedurally improper, that there was bias within the system. Now, recently there has been attempted arguments to bring in a European concept. We heard about margin of appreciation earlier. There's been an attempt to bring in a European concept of proportionality into judicial review. And essentially proportionality means, is the decision proportionate to the ends that are trying to be achieved? Now that's a European concept. This has been rejected in England because if a judge is starting to consider proportionality, that is then a merits-based decision. They're actually looking at the decision itself and not the decision-making process. And so that has been rejected in this country. Human rights, absolutely. If there are human rights implications, we've heard from Charlotte, particularly about Article 8 today. If there is a human rights dimension, then that can be brought in, of course, to the claim. So I considered, can we judicially review the regulations? Number one, potential legal challenge. Does Schedule 1 in the regulations equate to these substances having no medicinal use? You often hear there's no recognised medicinal use and a high risk for abuse. You often hear that. But I've scoured the regulations and I can't find that written. Okay, it's just silent. There's just Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's just silent. So I had to delve a little bit deeper, and I found a letter from the chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs to Theresa May when she was the Home Secretary back in 2012, and he referred to Schedule 1 as having no recognised medicinal use. And I thought, man, we can go after this. We've got a lot of research coming through that demonstrates medicinal use. I was pretty energised at this point. But then the wording changed, and you'll see in a government response to a petition, and I'm going to go on to petitions next, they say herbal cannabis is listed in Schedule 1 as a drug with no recognised medicinal uses outside research. It's clever, isn't it? It's all about language.
If the research is conclusive, then it naturally goes beyond that, doesn't it?
Well, hopefully we'll be getting that. But of course, when were these regulations made? Are we acting within the 3 months that judicial review allows us to act? Well, unfortunately, we're time barred, aren't we? Okay, so even if there was a way to challenge this, we're time barred on the regulations as they currently stand. So, can we bring about a new decision of the Home Secretary? You'll see Amber Rudd there on the right. Could we get a new decision from her which was irrational, where the decision-making process was procedurally improper or illegal? Well, Section 31 of the Misuse of Drugs Act says the Secretary of State, that is the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, shall not make any regulations under this Act except after consultation with the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. So if the chair of the Advisory Council said, right, we need to reschedule psychedelics because of all this promising research that's being done, and then the Home Secretary refused to follow that, then potentially there could be a judicial review mounted at that point, as long as it's brought within 3 months of the decision of the Home Secretary. Problem is, the last time the chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs told the government that their policy was wrong, and many of you will recognise this diagram from the Lancet in 2007, that of course was David Nutt, and he was sacked by Alan Johnson because Alan Johnson considered that he was campaigning against government policy. So do I expect the current chair of the Advisory Council to go down the same path? Unfortunately not. Is there another route that we could legally challenge? Right, okay, so we've got some new laws in this country which allow petitions. So, a petition, a number of signatures, 100,000 signatures, means that the matter will be debated in Parliament. 10,000 signatures means the matter will get a governmental response. So, in 2015, we had this petition, Make the Production, Sale and Use of Cannabis Legal. 236,000 signatures. Here's the government's response. Substantial scientific evidence shows cannabis is a harmful drug that can damage human health. There are no plans to legalise cannabis as it would not address the harm to individuals and communities. It's a very enlightened response, isn't it? Another petition. This was the next year. We demand the British government reschedule cannabis. I think this was doomed to failure just from the language in the initial petition. But there were some interesting things in the response from the government. In 2013, the Home Office undertook a scoping exercise targeted at a cross-section of the scientific community, including the main research bodies in response to concerns from a limited number of research professionals, including David Nutt, that Schedule 1 status was generally impeding research into new drugs. Okay, so the Home Office undertook an exercise back in 2013, and this was their conclusion. Our analysis of the responses confirmed a high level of interest, both generally and at an institutional level, in Schedule 1 research. However, the responses did not support the view that Schedule 1 controlled drug status impedes research in this area. While the responses confirmed Home Office licensing costs and requirements form part of a number of issues which influence decisions to undertake research in this area, ethics approval was identified as the key consideration, whilst the next most important consideration was the availability of funding. I find that government response disingenuous. If Schedule 1 is the reason you can't get ethical approval, then Schedule 1's the problem. Okay? So I really do find that response disingenuous. Another one, just from March in this year, the legalisation of all forms of cannabis for recreational and medicinal use. Right, here we get a real inkling into government policy at the present time. The government is aware of different approaches being taken abroad and of the associated debates. However, it may be years before we can fully understand the effect on public health and crime as a result of the decisions to legalise and regulate the production, supply and possession of cannabis, as data on harms, benefits and revenues will take some time to gather. That's the British government policy. Okay, we're not going to lead in this, and we might not even follow. We're going to see what's happening in other places, in other countries. Then we'll analyse the data and we'll come to a conclusion. Well, these are some of the countries that they're going to be looking at. These countries have gone through some legislative process in relation to medicinal cannabis. So we've got Spain. I could have done a pub quiz here, but I'm not going to in the interest of time. We've got Spain, Germany, Poland, Portugal, Ireland, Czech Republic, and most recently Mexico, where the president of Mexico issued a decree, I think within the past month, about medicinal cannabis. Portugal's my favourite one, though. They've moved personal possession from the criminal sphere into the civil sphere, and they have a 3-man drug dissuasion committee that attempt to dissuade you to put down your drugs.
5 minutes including questions.
5 minutes including questions.
Surely USA, parts of USA.
Absolutely, and I've already showed those in a previous slide. So in this country, we currently have a new market in CBD. We have a new market in CBD oils and tinctures. And because of recent research about CBD and the beneficial effect of it in a number of illnesses, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in October last year said, "We have come to the opinion that products containing CBD used for medical purposes are a medicine." Okay, well that sounds great, doesn't it? That seems a change in government policy. CBD is a medicine. But there's a caveat. There's a problem. Medicinal products must have a product license, a marketing authorization before they can be legally sold, supplied or advertised in the UK unless exempt. Licensed medicinal products have to meet safety, quality and efficacy standards to protect public health. So in effect, they are bringing the CBD market, which has been unregulated, into the regulatory sphere. That means you are now dealing with a medicine. You're now dealing with the Medicines Act 68 and the Human Medicines Regulations 2012. We're into a new legal sphere. So what's happened? The market has coalesced. They've created something called the Cannabis Trades Association UK. And the Cannabis Trades Association are currently consulting with the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency and saying, well, if we don't market it as a medicine, if we market it as a food supplement, can we self-regulate the market? So even though the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency said take your products off by Christmas, the products are still available online and in certain pharmacies. So there is a dialogue that's happening with the CBD marketplace and the regulatory agency at the present time. How long do I have, Charlotte?
Oh, you have 3 minutes, John.
I have 3 minutes, but it is a break after me, isn't it?
Talk in your break, that's your discipline.
Well, everybody looks rapt or bored, and I'm never able to distinguish between the two. Rapt. Okay, right, rapt. Bored, anybody? Bored? A double board at the front. Okay, it's normally at the back, actually. Rat! We've got rats over here as well. So, coming back to psychedelic research, we have classic university research occurring. University College of London recently was advertising for heavy drinkers, and they're going to be looking at the use of ketamine and alcoholism. Many of you will have been at Robin Carhart Harris's lecture on Friday about the fantastic work Imperial College in London have been doing with psilocybin, also with LSD, and you'll have seen a lot of those wonderful diagrams in the press. So that's what I'd call classic research. What I would consider to be new research, though, is the combination of universities with private businesses. Now, many of you will be aghast at that, but I think this may be a way through. So GW Pharmaceuticals, who produced Sativex, but then had real problems. It has been licensed in 29 countries, but recently the NICE organisation said it was too expensive. It was £11 a day, and therefore they recommended that Sativex is not prescribed in England. Wales have gone against this. Wales have made their own decision. So GW are now looking at non-THC preparations. Here's Epidiolex. They're doing trials, stage 2, stage 3, with autism, epilepsy, schizophrenia, and glioma, spinal and cancerous tumours. And they've got St. George's University researching glioma. Okay, so there's a combination of private business and university research. You'll have heard about Oxford University. Kingsley Capital Partners have granted £10 million to Oxford University to research cannabis. Kingsley Capital Partners have then spawned 2 cannabis companies, Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies, and this company at the bottom is called Forma, which is developing cannabis, or proposes to develop cannabis marketplaces. Now, I've been speaking with Rick Doblin, here, the wonderful guy, the head of MAPS, and he's of the view that the regulatory system isn't holding back research, and that you actually have to use the system and play the system as it is. So we know MAPS has just been granted phase 3 approval in America with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. I also heard yesterday the USONA Institute is going through the same regulatory process with psilocybin as well. That's with the FDA. I heard that Compass Holdings, are also going through that process with the European Medicines Agency. The problem is, if we leave Europe, when we leave Europe, we may not be covered by the European Medicines Agency. We may not be covered by the European Commission decisions. So my real concern here is that we become isolated from Europe. We have a very retroactive government policy, and we fall behind the rest of the world in researching the beneficial and medicinal uses of psychedelics. And I'll conclude my talk there with some art by Android Jones.